palace. There was an unequivocal pattern of the networks shadowing Mr. Hariri. On a number of occasions between Thursday, the 11th of November 2004 and Monday, 14th of February 2005, it is obvious from the presence of network mobiles connecting to cells near where Mr. Hariri's security detail was that they had, quote, followed, unquote, him to where he was. One striking feature is that during Mr. Hariri's absences from Lebanon, network activity significantly scaled down and most ceased around Kuratum Palace. The patterns of calls between network mobiles, their presence connecting to cells around Kuratum Palace, the airport, and in the Faraya area, and in other places where Mr. Hariri was, such as his visits to churches, his dinners and lunches, is beyond coincidence. There are too many calls and too many instances of network mobiles sharing a locality with Mr. Hariri, and over an extended period, for this to be accidental. This happened too often and in too many different places to be spontaneous. The mobile users were communicating in closed networks, and on different days their users operated in locations where Mr. Hariri was present. There was also static surveillance, and clear patterns emerged of network mobile presence near Kuratum Palace and along the route to Mr. Hariri's Fakra Villa near Faraya. Significantly, there was very little network activity around Kuratum Palace when Mr. Hariri was not there. The users of the blue, red and yellow networks, and more specifically the 6 core red mobiles, the 6 core blue mobiles and the 4 core yellow mobiles, conducted observations or surveillance of Mr. Hariri and his movements on different days from Wednesday the 20th of October 2004 to Monday the 14th of February 2005. The trial chamber is therefore satisfied that the only reasonable conclusion available from the evidence is that Mr. Hariri was under surveillance from Wednesday the 20th of October 2004 to Monday the 14th of February 2005, with the surveillance in the latter period connected with his possible assassination. But the trial chamber cannot find that all of it was connected with the plan to assassinate, that is, to murder Mr. Hariri. The evidence only suffices to establish that the final decision to assassinate Mr. Hariri was most probably made sometime in early February 2005. The trial chamber cannot, however, positively conclude that the surveillance in October, November and December 2004 and January 2005 was solely for the purpose of planning his assassination, his murder. Undoubtedly, some of it in the latter part of January 2005 was directed at obtaining information about Mr. Hariri's movements and convoy, if needed, to continue with a plan to assassinate him, which had been hatched by then. At least some of the users of the red, yellow, green and blue networks had a common mission, namely the assassination of Mr. Hariri. However, the fact that these networks were connected and that their existence was linked to Mr. Hariri's movements and eventually his assassination does not mean that every user of every network mobile knew about the mission to assassinate him. That is, either in detail or at all. The next topic is the Canter, the Mitsubishi Canter. 2 men purchased the Canter in cash in mid-January 2005 in Tripoli. Neither call data records nor the dealership's records can confirm the sale date. The prosecution argues that the truck was sold on the 25th of January 2005 and Mr. عياش coordinated its purchase. The preponderance of witness evidence supports that date, which is confirmed by the network activity. The عياش defence submits that 17th of January 2005 is the more likely date. Indeed, they say that cell coverage records prove it could not have been 25th of January 2005, and that the witnesses' conclusion about that date was unpersuasive given the methods by which they reached it. Furthermore, according to the عياش defence, Mr. عياش was in Saudi Arabia, not Lebanon, from 15th to 28th of January 2005. The trial chamber has concluded that 25th of January 2005 is the more likely date. There is, however, insufficient evidence to determine beyond reasonable doubt either any particular network mobile user's role in the Cantor's purchase or what any of them did afterwards to prepare it for use in the attack on Mr. Hariri's life. Turning to the false claim of responsibility for the attack. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion on Monday the 14th of February 2005, Beirut was in a state of chaos and crisis. The trial chamber received evidence of an atmosphere of turmoil that included the overloading of the mobile networks and a breakdown in communications. People were desperately trying to obtain information about family and friends. The crime scene was swamped with emergency and security personnel, journalists and many others who should not have been there, including people looking for their loved ones. It was at first unclear whether Mr. Hariri had survived the attack. When his death was announced, the obvious question was, who was responsible? It was in this setting, but before Mr. Hariri was officially confirmed dead, that the Beirut offices of Reuters and Al Jazeera received calls claiming responsibility for the attack. Some hours later, international media outlets then broadcast a claim of responsibility for the attack, in which a 22-year-old Palestinian, Mr. Ahmed Abu Adas, claimed responsibility for the attack on behalf of an unknown fundamentalist group called El-Nusra wal-Jihad fi Bilad el-Sham. In English, that's translated as Victory and Jihad in Greater Syria. Mr. Abu Adas's family had reported him missing a month earlier, on the 16th of January 2005. The prosecutor's case is that the claim of responsibility was false and that the fundamentalist group is fictional. Rather, that Mustafa Badruddin, Mr. Merhai, Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra were responsible for manufacturing a false claim of responsibility to deflect attention away from the true perpetrators of the attack. Under Mr. Merhai's coordination, Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra are alleged to have participated in disseminating statements falsely attributing responsibility for the attack, ensuring the delivery of the video and a letter to Al Jazeera, and that the video would be broadcast. Their role in the claim of responsibility is the sole basis for Mr. Merhai, Mr. Onesi, and Mr. Sabra's alleged criminal responsibility. The core events of the false claim plot as alleged by the prosecutor were the following. First, the conspirators identifying a suitable person to make the false claim, namely Mr. Abu Adas, who was a young, introverted person with strong religious leanings in the Arab University Mosque in Beirut. Mr. Onesi allegedly befriended Mr. Abu Adas by pretending to be, quote, Muhammad, unquote, who needed assistance in learning to pray. Secondly, affecting the disappearance of Mr. Abu Adas from his home on Sunday, the 16th of January 2005, Mohammed, namely Mr. Onesi, also participated in this, according to the prosecutor. Thirdly, creating a video in which Mr. Abu Adas falsely claimed responsibility for the attack on Mr. Hariri. If I said fourth, I meant thirdly. And fourthly, disseminating and publishing the false claim via media outlets immediately after the assassination on Monday, the 14th of February 2005. The trial chamber heard evidence of what occurred in the mosque in January 2005 from Mr. Abu Adas's family, friends and associates, and of those who received and broadcast also of those who received and broadcast the video on the afternoon of Monday, the 14th of February. As noted earlier, the trial chamber was not convinced beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Mihai was using green 071, nor that Mr. Sabra was the sole user of purple 018. But to do justice to the prosecutor's case, the trial chamber has also analysed the evidence, but working on the assumption that Mr. Sabra was purple 018's single user. So even if the trial chamber is legally wrong about that, it has still nonetheless analysed whether, if they were using these mobiles, they could still be guilty. 4 calls were made to the news outlets Reuters and Al Jazeera in Beirut in the afternoon after the attack, from 4 different payphones and using the same telecard. These were 1 to Reuters at 14:11 and 3 to Al Jazeera at 14:19, 15:27 and 17:04. The Beirut Al Jazeera bureau chief, Mr. Hassan Benjedo, took 3 calls relating to this. At around 14:19, someone called Al Jazeera's Beirut office. Mr. Benjedo testified that the caller said something very similar to the written text containing the claim of responsibility for the assassination, which the Al Jazeera office received later that afternoon. The second call was at 15:27. The caller told Mr. Benjedo that there was a videotape on a tree near the Al Jazeera building next to a pink building. He said that it must be retrieved within 15 minutes or it would not be found. A technician working at Al Jazeera then volunteered to go and get the tape. He walked around the tree 2 or 3 times before he noticed a white box on one of the branches. He climbed about a metre or a metre and a half up the tree and collected the box. A third call was made to Al Jazeera at 17:04. The caller became threatening and in a sharp voice said that Al Jazeera would hear a lot in the future about the group claiming responsibility for the attack, and that it was in the company's interest to cooperate. The video was broadcast on Al Jazeera at 17:30 that afternoon. The video tape contained a footage of Mr. Abu Adas, who was seated under a banner purportedly to be that of the group El-Nusra wal-Jihad fi Bilad el-Sham, reading out a claim of responsibility, stating the following: to inflict just punishment upon the agent of that regime and its cheap tool in Greater Syria, the sinner and holder of ill-gotten gains, Rafik Hariri, through the execution of a resounding martyrdom operation, such as to confirm our promise of victory and jihad and to herald numerous martyrdom operations against the infidels, apostates and tyrants in the Greater Syria. The letter accompanying the videotape stated that a suicide mission had been carried out what was described as the, quote, agent of infidelity in the land of the two holy places, unquote, meaning Mr. Rafik Hariri and Saudi Arabia, and through a suicide operation carried out by Ahmed Abu Adas. And it said, quote, attached is a film of the martyr Ahmed Abu Adas who carried out the operation, unquote. The trial chamber cannot determine who made the calls, nor how many callers there were. Mr. Benjeddo testified that 3 different people called Al Jazeera regarding the claim of responsibility. It is also possible that another, different person called Reuters, although it is most likely that the same people made the calls. There is no way of comparing whether the same person or persons called both Reuters and Al Jazeera. The trial chamber also cannot determine when the package was placed in the tree. There is no evidence about whether it was placed there before or after the attack. Further, the 2 mobile telecommunications networks, Alpha and MTC Touch, suffered instability and congestion on the afternoon of Monday, 14th of February 2005 in Beirut, after the attack on Mr. Hariri, and especially in the area relatively near the crime scene. This affects the reliability of this evidence. The network congestion that afternoon means that Mr. Sabra's shared purple mobile and Mr. Onesi's personal purple mobile may not have been connecting to the best serving cell for any of the calls they made that afternoon. Theoretically, they could have been in the coverage area of any of the 6 neighbouring cells or cells adjacent to these when they made the calls. It is, of course, suspicious that the user of Purple 018 and Mr. Onesi as the user of Purple 095, or both, were relatively near the 4 payphones or the tree containing the video on Monday, 14th of February 2005. This, though, is in the qualified sense of there being at least within a few kilometres of them at relevant times, while recognising the possible patterns that emerge, and that this occurred within a comparatively short period around when the calls to Reuters and Al Jazeera were made and the video was collected. The strongest evidence is that the users of the 2 purple mobiles were connecting to a cell providing coverage to a tree when the Al Jazeera employee collected that package, thus potentially allowing them to observe what was happening. However, the networks were congested at the time. The mobile users may have been somewhere nearby and not connecting to the cell providing this coverage, and therefore not within viewing distance of the tree. It is impossible to tell. The patterns of contacts between Purple 018 and Purple 095 and Purple 018 and Purple 231, that's Mr. Merai's mobile, also clearly attract suspicion. These mobiles were in contact with each other on Monday the 14th of February 2005 at times relatively close to the times of the telephone calls and the video collection. However, Mr. Benjeddo firmly stated that there were 3 distinct callers. He may well have been mistaken. It is of course possible that one person, disguising their voice, made all 3 calls. The caller or callers may not even have been male, but that is the evidence. So, however suspicious the Purple Mobile's movements and communications with each other on Monday the 14th of February 2005 and in the preceding weeks are, they are insufficient to establish Mr. Onesi's and Mr. Sabra's involvement in the claim of responsibility. there is too much uncertainty surrounding what they were doing. There is no evidence of the content of their calls, their texts, and whether they met or where and when and what was discussed. Nor does the evidence establish that Mr. Sabra was using Purple 018 that afternoon. The Purple mobile activity highlighted by the prosecution is too remote in time and distance to demonstrate that the accused, that is Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra, were present at the payphones when the calls were made, were otherwise involved in the calls, or were located at the site of the video collection. Going back to the person in the video, the false claim plot centres on its subject, Mr. Ahmed Abu Adas. He was a young man, perhaps with an introverted personality, who in the period before his disappearance was becoming increasingly religious. He was attending the mosque near his home daily and had developed an interest in Islamic literature. Mr. Abu Adas also appears to have been disinterested in politics. These factors in the trial chamber's assessment could have made him susceptible to approaches from groups wishing to recruit young, vulnerable people to their religious causes. But he could not drive. This also reasonably excludes him as a suicide bomber. The evidence implicating Mr. Merai, Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra in participating in the activities relating to making the claim of responsibility on the prosecution's case must be considered in combination with the evidence of their alleged involvement in Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance in January 2005, including that of his alleged, quote, abduction, unquote. The evidence in this respect is completely circumstantial. The prosecutor alleged that in late December 2004 to early January 2005, Mr. Abu Adas was identified as a likely scapegoat for making the false claim. Mr. Onesi, the prosecutor pleaded, posing as Muhammad, approached people, including Mr. Abu Adas, at the Arab University Mosque in Beirut. The telecommunications evidence also placed Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra around the Arab University Mosque in the relevant period. The evidence of Mr. Abu Adas's possible encounters with anyone called Muhammad in the mosque in that period, that is in December 2004 and January 2005, is mostly hearsay, and in some cases comes from statements admitted into evidence of unavailable witnesses who did not testify and could not be cross-examined by the defence. This substantially diminishes their reliability. The thread running through all accounts is of Mr. Abu Adas teaching someone to pray in the mosque near his home in the weeks before his disappearance. But only one witness provided direct evidence of Mr. Abu Adas apparently teaching anyone to pray in the mosque. That witness saw Mr. Abu Adas with a young man in the mosque shortly before his disappearance. Now, Mr. Abu Adas disappeared on Sunday, the 16th of January 2005. He was teaching the young man how to pray. Another witness encountered a, quote, Muhammad, unquote, in the mosque at the beginning of January 2005, who said that he did not know how to pray and would like the witness to teach him how. The witness pointed at Mr. Abu Adas as someone who could and was better suited to teach this Muhammad how to pray. More than 5 years later, the witness tapped on Mr. Onesi's photograph on a photo board and shown to the witness by prosecution investigators. However, the two witnesses do not necessarily correlate or corroborate each other. There is no certainty that they were referring to the same person and that it was the, quote, Muhammad, unquote, in question. The prosecution has therefore not established beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Abu Adas met a person called Muhammad at the mosque in late December 2004 or early January 2005 and taught him how to pray. Moreover, the purported identification evidence of Muhammad as Mr. Onesi was flawed and unreliable. There was a gap of more than 5 years between when the witness saw Muhammad in the Arab University Mosque in January 2005 and the purported identification of Mr. Onesi as this Muhammad to prosecution investigators in March 2010. The identification was also conducted in a flawed manner. An Onesi defence expert, whose evidence the trial chamber has accepted, testified about this. The trial chamber has therefore not relied on the identification evidence. Judge Nolsworthy will read the next portion.
Thank you. The prosecution's case alleging Mr. Onesi's and Mr. Sabra's involvement in the Mohammed quote-unquote story and Mr. Abu Addas's disappearance and his subsequent appearance in the broadcast video hinges upon it proving their presence in and near the Arab University Mosque at the relevant times in late December 2004 and early January 2005. The allegation that Mr. Onesi befriended Mr. Abu Addas, pretending to be Mohammed and seeking assistance in learning how to pray, was central to this part of the case. To a large extent, the prosecution case theory of Mr. Merai's, Mr. Onesi's and Mr. Sabra's involvement in the plot to kill Mr. Hariri relied upon proof that Mr. Onesi was Mohammed as the linchpin for proving his and Mr. Sabra's involvement in the telephone calls to Al Jazeera and Reuters on the 14th of February 2005. The combination of this evidence, together with the Purple Mobile's activations on the afternoon of Monday, 14 February, might have allowed the trial chamber to draw the necessary inferences that they were responsible for making the calls to the news agencies. However, without the evidence of their pleaded participation in the Mohammed quote-unquote story, and by extension, Mr. Abu Addas's disappearance, their only connection to the conspiracy was Mr. Onesi's Purple 095s and Mr. Sabra's attributed Purple 018's presence at various times at locations near the payphones and the tree on the afternoon of the 14th of February 2005, and additionally, quote-unquote, near the Arab University Mosque in December 2004 and January 2005. So once the main evidence linking Mr. Onesi with Mohammed is eliminated from consideration, the prosecution's case against the three accused considerably weakens. Mr. Onesi's Purple 095 was, quote, in the vicinity, unquote, of the mosque on 5 days, in the sense of connecting to nearby cells. A witness described meeting a Mohammed in the mosque on one of the 2 of these days. The mobile Purple 018 used by Mr. Sabra and his wife was also near, quote-unquote, the mosque on 8 days in the same period. The trial chamber, however, cannot find that Mr. Abu Addas met a Mohammed, quote-unquote, in the mosque. It has only concluded that a witness met someone named Mohammed there in early January 2005, that this person asked the witness to teach him how to pray, and the witness pointed at nearby Mr. Abu Adas as someone who was better suited to teach this Mohammed how to pray. There was no reliable evidence that Mr. Abu Adas actually did this. Mr. Onassis' mobile's presence in the vicinity, quote unquote, of the mosque on one of the two possible dates for the encounter is insufficient of itself to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Onassis was the Mohammed. This is so even when considering it with the totality of the Purple Mobile's activity at the time. There was no evidence connecting calls between the three Purple Mobiles with anything related to Mr. Abu Adas, the mosque, anyone called Mohammed, Mr. Abu Adas' disappearance, the video or its making or its broadcast. And the last call between Green 071, attributed to Mr. Merai, and Mr. Badruddin on Green 023 was on Monday, 7th of February, 2005, in circumstances which appeared to the trial chamber to be devoid of context. There is also no reliable evidence connecting any of the three with Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance from his home on the morning of Sunday, 16 January 2005. The evidence that Mr. Abu Adas left home with Mohammed, quote unquote, is insufficiently reliable to find that this occurred. Mr. Abu Adas could equally have left with someone else or could have departed alone. The trial chamber cannot safely find that Mr. Abu Adas left with Mohammed on Sunday, 16 January 2005. On the morning of Sunday, 16 January 2005, Green 071 called Mr. Badruddin's Green 023 5 times. Despite this, there's no reliable evidence connecting Mr. Merai's calls on his attributed Green Network mobile to Mr. Badruddin that morning with the disappearance, notwithstanding the temporal coincidence with his disappearance that day. Therefore, the only conclusion reasonably available from the cell-site evidence of the mobile activities is that the trial chamber cannot positively find that any of the three accused were involved in Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance on Sunday, 16th January 2005. The trial chamber cannot determine when the videotape was made, beyond the obvious that it was made after Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance on Sunday, 16 January, and before Mr. Hariri's assassination on Monday, 14 February 2005. There is no evidence connecting any of the accused with the making of the video, nor any of the other preparatory acts to making the claim of responsibility on Monday, 14 February 2005. The trial chamber, therefore, cannot conclude that the only inference reasonably available from the totality of the evidence is that any of the three accused were involved in making the video used in the false claim of responsibility for the attack. The heart of the prosecution's case against Mr. Merai, Mr. Onesi, and Mr. Sabra is that the claim of responsibility was false. The amended consolidated indictment avers that they participated in making a knowingly false claim of responsibility, and the prosecution's case proceeded on that basis. However, no direct evidence that it was a false claim of responsibility was produced at trial. There is also no direct evidence linking Mr. Abu Adas with the crime scene. The only evidence is his appearance on the video. The only evidence about the existence or otherwise of this group comes from Mr. Benjedo, who testified that it had not been heard of before or after the claim of responsibility. Mr. Abu Adas may have voluntarily joined a fictitious jihadi group, or perhaps thought that he had joined a real one and freely participated in a video claiming responsibility for an attack before it had occurred. Maybe he was lured into making the video for unknown reasons, or alternatively, he was forced to do so. The evidence is, however, insufficient to allow the trial chamber to draw any positive conclusions either way. The trial chamber is satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that the claim of responsibility for the attack, as shown in the video, letter, and telephone calls to Reuters and Al Jazeera, was a false claim. The most likely explanation is that those responsible for Mr. Hariri's assassination attempted to turn attention away from themselves by diverting it to someone claiming hatred of Mr. Hariri based upon his connections with Saudi Arabia, ostensibly to avenge the deaths of those who Saudi security forces had killed. The trial chamber, however, cannot positively determine from the totality of the evidence whether Mr. Abu Adas was forced to participate in the making of the video, or alternatively, whether he did so voluntarily. Either is possible. Given that Mr. Abu Adas does not claim to be the suicide bomber, he could have been tricked into making and participating in the video. On the other hand, he could have agreed to do it without needing to have been duped. The content of the video itself does not permit the trial chamber to draw an inference one way or the other. The trial chamber also cannot make any explicit finding about Mr. Abu Adas's fate. He's most likely deceased, and most possibly from soon after his disappearance. However, there is no evidence on the record from which the trial chamber can make a definitive finding about what happened to him or when. Mr. Abu Adas was not the suicide bomber. and his disappearance is consistent with him being used to set up a false claim of responsibility for the attack by those who perpetrated it. The evidence also suggests that the group El-Nusra wal Jihad fi Bilad el-Sham was fictitious, meaning that both aspects of the false claim were indeed false. Further, even if the trial chamber's conclusion that Mr. Abu Adas was not the suicide bomber is incorrect, the findings of criminal responsibility against Mr. Merai, Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra would not change. Whether or not Mr. Sabra was the suicide bomber, there is still insufficient evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt their participation in the counts charged in the amended consolidated indictment. Mr. Merai, Mr. Onesi, and Mr. Sabra were, on the prosecution's case, using their personal mobiles to communicate, at least by mobile telephone, in executing the false claim of responsibility. However, 1 or 2 days after Mr. Hariri's assassination, they were all discarded. The coincidental cessation in the use of the purple mobiles after several years of active use may indeed suggest that this decision came after a certain event and due to some fear. However, such a decision in the context of an alleged conspiracy whose participants otherwise used a covert network seems contradictory and, in the trial chamber's view, difficult to explain. However, ultimately, it is not the only reasonable inference available from the evidence. Another is that they were not involved in the alleged criminal activity, or that they were not previously aware of the scope and significance of their call activity. Otherwise, they would not have used their personal mobiles to carry it out. The prosecutor relied on this strand of evidence to buttress a circumstantial case regarding mobile usage. The discarding of the mobiles was used to help prove that the 3 accused were involved in making the false claim of responsibility. Conversely, the mobile activities on Monday, 14 February 2005, were used to prove that something occurred that required the 3 to discard their mobiles over the next few days. That is, that they had a criminal reason to do so. In other words, the 2 strands of evidence must be taken together. Hence, even if the trial chamber is wrong in not finding that the only inference reasonably available from the evidence is that the discarding of the mobiles soon after the attack means that they were involved in the attack, this only has context when considered with all the other cell site evidence. But as the trial chamber cannot be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that the mobiles' activities on the afternoon of 14 February only equated to participation in the false claim of responsibility, then discarding these mobiles within the next 2 days cannot persuade the trial chamber that the prosecutor has proved that they were used in the false claim. The prosecution has therefore not proved its case beyond reasonable doubt of Mr. Merai's, Mr. Onassis and Mr. Sabra's participation in the false claim of responsibility for the attack on Mr. Hariri. The trial chamber will now move to committing a terrorist act by means of an explosive device. The explosion on the 14th of February 2005 was a terrorist act within the meaning of Article 314 of the Lebanese Criminal Code, committed by means liable to create a public danger, such as explosive devices. Detonating an explosive device, in inverted commas, of 2,500 to 3,000 kilograms of TNT, equivalent high explosives, set on the back of a light truck, falls squarely within Article 314 as one committed by means liable to create a public danger. This particular device was of such a powerful explosive RDX and so large that it was inevitably going to kill or injure numerous people who were nearby when it exploded. Detonating a device of that magnitude, likewise, was inevitably going to destroy or damage proximate buildings and vehicles and ignite fires. The explosion endangered anyone and any nearby property without doubt. The device exploded in a busy city street in the middle of a weekday. It was detonated approximately 50 to 80 meters above ground level. I beg your pardon. It was detonated approximately 50 to 80 centimeters above ground level in a street lined by multi-story buildings. This created a, quote, canyon effect, unquote, that increased its destructive powers. Numerous members of the public were bound to have been inside buildings or passing by, in vehicles or on foot, and within the explosion's range, regardless of the fact that the target was in fact Mr. Rafik Hariri. And hundreds were, as is shown by the proportion of those killed and injured, who were not members of Mr. Hariri's convoy. More than half of the 22 killed by the explosion, other than the suicide bomber, and almost all of the 226 others who were injured had no connection with Mr. Hariri's convoy. The explosion was an act intended to cause a state of terror. The size and power of the explosive device, the manner, the time, and the place of its detonation and its intended target prove this fact. Detonating the device in those circumstances obviously had the potential to cause fear and panic among at least members of the public in the area of the detonation. Anyone knowing that the attack was to be committed in this manner must have foreseen these consequences. The fact that a suicide bomber targeted Mr. Hariri also shows that the explosion was intended to cause a state of terror. It was foreseeable that the public would learn that a suicide bomber triggered the attack and that this too would frighten and horrify them. Indeed, the video featuring Mr. Abu Adas expressly claimed that a suicide bomber had triggered the explosion. Mr. Hariri was a former Prime Minister of Lebanon and a prominent political figure who, at the time of his death, was preparing for parliamentary elections in May 2005. His murder, or attempted murder, in a huge explosion would attract enormous publicity and cause many Lebanese to experience fear, insecurity, and loss. The evidence from participating victims and witnesses proves that this in reality occurred. Anyone who knew that the explosion was to be triggered in the street when Mr. Hariri's convoy was passing must have foreseen that numerous people would be killed or injured, regardless of whether it succeeded in killing him, Mr. Hariri. The state of terror was not
steps with numerous different mobile users having conducted surveillance, for instance. The trial chamber cannot establish how many knowing participants there were in the overall conspiracy. Some, but not all of these people, needed to know that the conspiracy to commit a terrorist act had Mr. Hariri as its target. Those involved in the surveillance of Mr. Hariri's movements in December 2004 and January and February 2005 must have known that he and his convoy were the targets of the surveillance. The user of every core red, blue, and yellow mobile, including Mr. عياش, who conducted surveillance of Mr. Hariri and his movements, would have known that Mr. Hariri was a person under watch, although they did not need to know the precise reason why they had to have been trusted associates. This could have been, though, common membership in an organization. The 6 core red mobile users must have known who they were tracking on the day of the attack, both from their actions that day and their role in the surveillance leading to it. As for the claim of responsibility, anyone who was aware of the content of the videotape or its accompanying letter before the attack necessarily knew that Mr. Hariri was the intended victim of martyrdom, the term used in the video of the claim of responsibility, or a suicide operation. But knowledge of this fact alone does not necessarily extend to awareness that Mr. Hariri was going to die in a terrorist attack using an explosive device, as opposed to another manner of attack, for example, by shooting him in a public place. And the video does not mention how Mr. Hariri was to die, nor when. Whoever triggered the explosive device that was on the counter knew that they were detonating an explosive device in a public location in a manner intended to spread terror and that it would kill and injure people. They must have known that they were going to detonate the explosives when Mr. Hariri's convoy passed and that it was the target of the attack. The driver of the canter was required to move towards Mr. Hariri's convoy as it passed the St. George Hotel and to detonate the explosives. after eliminating other possibilities as not reasonably available on the evidence, the trial chamber has concluded beyond reasonable doubt that the suicide bomber himself detonated the explosives. The suicide bomber, therefore, at least legally, was a member of the conspiracy. And as his body was not identified, his identity remains unknown. The evidence does not establish that the two men who bought the canter in Tripoli in mid-January 2005 knew that it was intended to be used in attack on Mr. Hariri, or that it was to be loaded with RDX or other explosives and used in the attack in that way. There is no evidence of mobile use directly connecting Mr. عياش or any other accused person with its purchase. It is possible that whoever purchased the counter, or at least one of the two, either knew of or participated in placing the RDX on it. On the other hand, it is equally conceivable that they did not. The canter, however, was not sold to the two buyers until either Monday 17 or Tuesday 25 January 2005. Mr. عياش's green mobile was in Tripoli on 11 January. He may have been there looking around for a suitable vehicle to use it in the attack, but he may have been there for some other reason. Logically, those involved in the plot to kill Mr. Hariri would have participated in some way in the canter's purchase and employed a certain discipline while doing so. They most probably selected this particular truck yard in Tripoli because it sold trucks for cash with little documentation and without verifying buyers' identities. Its location in Tripoli also, as the prosecution contends, moved the purchaser away from Beirut, where the explosion was to occur. Nevertheless, those who actually bought the canter did not need to have been aware of the objective of the conspiracy. The conspiracy could have been tight, restricted to a handful of participants, or alternatively, one with a broader but still restricted membership, possibly limited to the 10 or so suggested by the prosecution. In this second scenario, the participants had varying roles, but each part was sufficiently important to the plan's success that before the attack on 14 February 2005, each of them knew its essential elements. That is, not just that their operation focused on Mr. Hariri, but also that the aim was to kill him and how this was to be done. The members of such a conspiracy would have included some or all of those who executed the terrorist attack, including the 6 core red mobile users on 14 February 2005 and, at least legally, the suicide bomber. They may also have included the 2 men who purchased the canter and the person or persons who loaded the explosives onto it. In addition, such a conspiracy could also have included those who pursued or directed others to do the acts needed to prepare for and execute the attack, even if they did not themselves participate directly in any of those acts. and those who prepared the false claim of responsibility for the attack. The dissemination of the claim of responsibility was clearly meant to divert attention away from the attackers and to avoid detection and apprehension, but the conspirators may also have intended to foster a state of terror by broadcasting a claim by an unknown, fictitious militant group. Preparing the false claim involved committing serious criminal acts, including the possible abduction and murder of Mr. Abu Adas, who disappeared in mid-January 2005. The planning and propagating the claim of responsibility, including preparing Mr. Abu Adas for the video and then filming him, required strict secrecy and particular skills. Evidently, at least one person who participated in it knew of its connection with Mr. Hariri's intended assassination before it occurred. The video, however, does not say how Mr. Hariri was to be murdered. There is no mention of an explosion. Whoever made the video must have known of its connection with Mr. Hariri's intended death. Logic dictates that more than one person would have been involved in making the video and preparing Mr. Abu Adas for his role in it. However, there is no evidence of when this occurred. The video must have been made between Sunday, 16 January 2005, when Mr. Abu Adas left his home, and the time when the attack occurred on Monday, 14 February 2005. But exactly when is a matter of speculation, as nothing connects any of the accused with anything related to making the video, including when, where, and how it was made. Apart from the 6 core Red mobile users, the suicide bomber, those who purchased the canter or loaded the explosives, those who prepared the false claim, and those who directed them, unknown others may have helped to prepare the attack and legally participated in the conspiracy. An alternative inference, namely that only a much smaller subset had the necessary knowledge to be conspirators, is also available on the evidence. The conspiracy plausibly could have comprised only those who definitely had to know the assassination's operations aim in order to fulfill their role in it. Thus, it is equally conceivable that the conspirators deliberately kept that aim secret from as many people involved as possible by doing key tasks such as assembling the explosive device themselves or restricting the information flow between their operatives, or both. The network's hierarchical and compartmentalized communication structure would have facilitated this. If membership of the conspiracy was on a need-to-know, quote-unquote, basis, this eliminates several potential conspirators. First, someone tasked only with conducting surveillance before the day of the attack did not need to know that its objective was to murder Mr. Hariri. Indeed, this may not have been the sole purpose of much of the surveillance. The trial chamber could therefore not conclude that all of those involved in the surveillance were knowingly participating in the conspiracy alleged. Rather, because of Mr. Hariri's status and the prevailing political environment, they could reasonably have thought they were just engaged in a routine monitoring of his movements. The evidence that Mr. Hariri thought that he was under surveillance also supports this possible inference. His security detail certainly believed this and must have factored this into the measures they adopted to protect him in the months before his death. Naturally, whoever who engaged in the surveillance would have had to have been trusted enough not to have revealed their roles in the enterprise, which would have become evident after the attack. In other words, anyone who had been involved in the surveillance of Mr. Hariri before 14 February 2005, using mobiles that they were instructed either to discard or to return to someone afterwards for collection, would have realized, at least after the explosion, that their surveillance activities were connected with the attack. Only trusted associates could have been assigned such a task. But this does not mean that all of them must also have been entrusted before the attack with the information that it would happen, nor how, nor when, nor they agreed to commit it. Similarly, while those whose role was confined to preparing either the claim of responsibility or the explosive device, if there were any such people, may have been fully aware of the conspiracy's aim, the evidence does not establish that they had to be. Rather, it is also reasonably conceivable that someone involved in the plot met Mr. Abu Adas in the Arab University Mosque and lured him from his home, but did not know that these actions were connected with Mr. Hariri's intended assassination, nor that he was to be killed specifically by a large explosive device. The trial chamber received no evidence from which it could conclude when, where, and how the explosives came to be on the counter. The evidence can only establish that it must have been between Monday 17 January and Monday 14 February 2005. For operational security and safety reasons, it can probably safely be assumed that the explosives were loaded onto the light truck only after firm decisions had been made to use the counter and when. Moreover, whoever put the explosives on the counter did not have to have known why, namely, that a suicide bomber was to drive it into Mr. Hariri's convoy, nor even that it was to be detonated in a public place. Placing explosives on a truck and their detonation at a later point are not necessarily connected activities, especially as it is unknown when the explosives were put on the counter. However, it is far more likely that whoever did this was involved in the conspiracy. It was a core activity in the conspiracy. And of necessity, such an action should have been restricted to those as on the plot. This is for the obvious reason that once the explosion occurred, anyone who had unknowingly assisted would have realized what they have done, thus potentially compromising the secrecy of the operation. However, a trusted operative could have been tasked with putting the explosives on the counter without being informed of precisely why, but nonetheless still sufficiently trusted not to reveal this afterwards. The explosives would have had a volume of a minimum of 1.3 cubic meters and weight close to 2 tons. The mere fact of placing or loading this quantity of RDX onto the counter would have been inherently suspicious. This 2 points to the involvement in the conspiracy of people with a commonality such a membership of an organization, namely a tight-knit organization in which trusted operatives are delegated particular sensitive tasks. The trial chamber, therefore, believes that the most logical inference available from the evidence is that whoever put the explosives on the counter was either part of the conspiracy or was trusted enough not to reveal their role in it. But it cannot be satisfied which, if either occurred. It simply has no direct evidence, one way or another, as to what occurred. Additionally, there is no circumstantial evidence from which it could draw an inference establishing how the RDX came to be on the counter or who put it there. Whether the conspiracy was thus restricted to 2 or was larger, its members might have decided together to assassinate Mr. Hariri in a large explosion in a public place before the red, blue, and yellow mobiles surveillance or any other preparation began. However, the conspirators may also have reached that decision later, perhaps as late as mid-January 2005, which is the earliest time on the evidence when the counter could have begun to have been fitted for the attack. Alternatively, if it were a larger conspiracy, some members, such as some of the red mobile users, may have joined that conspiracy well after it was formed, possibly even learning the full or real objective only on the morning of the attack. All of these scenarios are possible on the evidence, and any of them would fulfill the definition of a conspiracy, namely an agreement to commit the pleaded crime. The assassination of the former Lebanese prime minister did not occur in a vacuum, nor was it organized by the 6 core users of the Red Network. The political and background evidence points to it being a political act directed by those whose activities Mr. Hariri's were threatening. There is no evidence that Mr. عياش or the other 5 core red users fell into this category. The evidence is of their involvement in the conspiracy at least on 14 February 2005 and the immediate period leading to it. But the evidence does not establish affirmatively who directed them to murder Mr. Hariri and thus eliminate him as a political opponent.
To Mr. Saleem Jamil Cayyash. The evidence connecting Mr. Cayyash with the attack on Mr. Hariri stems from his use of mobile Red 741. Without this, there will be no evidence linking him with the explosion on 14th of February 2005. He did not detonate the explosive with his own hands. The Red Network was the assassination team, as we have said. It was a closed network that ceased operation immediately before the attack after its use in the previous month in the surveillance of Mr. Hariri and the convoy's movements. It operated extensively on the day of the attack. Red Network mobile users were near or in the area of Kuratum Palace just after Mr. Hariri had left for the Parliament, and were active in monitoring him at the Parliament when he was in the Parliament area. They must also have assisted in preparing the counter for the attack at the crime scene. The trial chamber agrees with the prosecution's description in the Red Network in the indictment and the final trial brief as the assassination team. The only reasonable conclusion available from the evidence is that on Monday 14th of February 2005, the Red mobiles tracked the movement of Mr. Hariri and his convoy, alerted the others involved of his location, and prepared for surveillance and for the execution of the attack along the route that he was expected to take. This must have also aimed at ensuring that the explosive detonated at the exact time the convoy would pass. The users of the Red mobiles had prepared the attack through repeated operations of surveillance and reconnaissance in previous days. Mr. Cayyash, as the user of Red 741, Blue 233 and Green 300, must have been a core member of the conspiracy. Subject 6 using Red 678 and Blue 610 was also a conspirator. Overall, by virtue of their activities on 14th of February 2005 and their surveillance of Mr. Hariri in the preceding weeks, the trial chamber is also convinced that the 6 core Red mobile users had the role that the prosecution alleged of an assassination team. They all knowingly agreed to murder Mr. Hariri using an explosive device. They are thus conspirators. Even if the conspiracy was kept deliberately tight, the users of the 6 core Red mobiles were participants. Some of those mobiles made significantly more calls than others did on the 14th of February. All 6 played a crucial role in executing the attack. The evidence also suggests that each Red mobile user also knew beforehand that the aim behind their tracking of Mr. Hariri that day was his murder using an explosive device in a public place. Besides the time and places that day at which they made and received calls, it is particularly relevant that every core Red mobile user then stopped using that mobile forever shortly before the attack. It is improbable that all of them would do this if some of them did not know that the attack was going to happen. Mobile user in any of the covert networks who had a supervision role, someone who not only reported on developments but also coordinated, directed and or supervised others, must have known about the mission, more about the mission than the users under their direction. The more extensive the contact that user had with other network mobile users and with the acts needed to prepare for and then execute the terrorist attack to kill Mr. Hariri, the more likely that they would know that the mission's overall aim was that attack. Mr. Cayash's Red 741 fits this profile. That mobile's call activity in the hours before the attack on the 14th of February 2005 in itself makes it inconceivable that its user did not know the aim of the conspiracy by then. Red 741's calls to 3 other core Red mobiles that morning triggered their users' relocation to the Parliament area, and by doing so launched the beginning of the operation. The trial chamber is satisfied that this is the only reasonable inference available from the evidence. This evidence also supports the inference that Red 741's user coordinated at least some of the acts that executed the attack. Red 741's contact within the Red network on the day of the attack was also uniquely extensive. Only Red 741 had calls with every other core Red mobile. Moreover, on 4 different days before 14th of February, Red 741 had had calls with various other Red mobile users at the same time that they were conducting mobile surveillance. The trial chamber, for these and other reasons, is therefore convinced beyond reasonable doubt of Mr. عياش's participation in the conspiracy alleged. It is the only reasonable inference available from the totality of the evidence. Regarding the date of the commencement of the conspiracy, it is not possible to find a definitive date on which those responsible for organising the conspiracy agreed that Mr. Hariri was to be assassinated. They may have initially formed the intention to murder him in late 2004, given the volatile political environment and events at the time, following President Lahoud's mandate extension. Among other political developments that the trial chamber has described by that time, where the first 2 Bristol group meetings had occurred on 22nd of September and 13th of December 2004. Mr. Hariri was then planning to run for office again and was known to wish to loosen Syrian dominance over Lebanon. Factually, the following demonstrates that the planning for a possible attack on Mr. Hariri must have started from at least mid-January 2005. The Red network handsets and SIM cards were purchased in Tripoli in late December 2004, early January 2005, and were initialized on 4th of January. The Red network, the assassination team of which Mr. عياش was a member, began surveillance of Mr. Hariri's movements from Friday 14th of January and continued doing so until his death. Mr. Abu Adas disappeared on Sunday 16th of January, and the video was made between then and the attack. The canter was purchased on either 17 or 25 January, but most probably on 25 January. It is highly probable that those responsible for organising Mr. Hariri's assassination decided to murder him only if he continued on his foreshadowed political path away from Syria, and had commenced their preparations for this by at least January 2005. Assassinating the former and probable future Prime Minister was an act that those responsible must have known would have had significant regional and international consequences. They could only have decided to go through with it after having made a careful cost-benefit analysis in which they judged that the advantages of eliminating Mr. Hariri would significantly outweigh the disadvantages. Despite these preparatory steps, none, either individually or collectively, inevitably led to Mr. Hariri's assassination. The video could have been made and never used, as Mr. Abu Adas was clearly dispensable. The canter could have been purchased and then used for some other purpose, or sold, and the information gained from the surveillance could have been stored for future use. The intended possible attack could have been aborted at any time. It is most likely that those responsible were prepared either way, namely, to continue the attack if necessary, or to call it off. This decision to kill Mr. Hariri, and in an enormous explosion in a public place, would not have been taken lightly. Mr. Hariri had numerous powerful regional and international allies and connections, including in the United States, France, Saudi Arabia, and United Nations officials. It is thus highly likely that the decision to give the go-ahead only occurred in February 2005, after the third Bristol Group meeting on Wednesday the 2nd of February 2005. Mr. Hariri had sent his delegates to the meeting. It was at this third meeting that its participants had agreed to call for the immediate and total withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon, a position that Mr. Hariri, according to his confidants, had by then adopted. They had also called for the dismantling of the Syrian security apparatus in Lebanon, with Mr. Hariri's tacit support. And significantly, the meeting had occurred the day after the Syrian Deputy Foreign Minister, Mr. Walid El-Mualim, visited Mr. Hariri at his home for the final time on Tuesday 1st of February 2005. The transcript of its audio recording reveals that Mr. Hariri had told Mr. El-Mualim that, quote, Lebanon will not be ruled by Syria forever, unquote, as it was, quote, unacceptable, unquote, and that he could, quote, bear no more orders, unquote, from Syria, and that, quote, 3/4 of me is already on the opposition side, unquote, and that there was, quote, interference in every small detail in the country, unquote, referring to Lebanon. Despite Mr. El-Mualim's approach to Mr. Hariri, the Bristol Group's public statement reported on Thursday, 3rd of February 2005, went further in relation to Syria's involvement in Lebanon than in its previous statements. A significant cross-section of the Lebanese political class was by then publicly advocating the full implementation of the 1989 end of civil war Taif agreement and Syria's political, security and military redeployment from Lebanon. The trial chamber is therefore satisfied, based on the confluence of these events, that the final decision to commit the terrorist act was made only in the 2 weeks preceding Mr. Hariri's death. This is the only inference reasonably available from the evidence. Because of his role in the conspiracy, Mr. عياش, as the user of red 741, blue 233 and green 300, must have known its aim, whether conditional or final, for some time before the attack. This was most likely by mid to late January 2005 at the latest, on the basis that the canter was most probably purchased on 25 January and preparations for its use in the attack could have begun. From the available evidence, however, the trial chamber cannot determine whether Mr. عياش, as the user of red 741, blue 233 and green 300, did anything in relation to either the false claim of responsibility or the preparation of the canter and the explosive device. In any event, it need not do this in order to determine his criminal responsibility. For the purposes of Mr. عياش's criminal responsibility, it is legally sufficient for the trial chamber to find that the evidence establishes beyond reasonable doubt that he agreed to commit the crimes charged by the day of the attack, namely Monday, 14th of February 2005. The trial chamber therefore finds that Mr. عياش was a member of the conspiracy in having agreed to commit the terrorist act charge from at least sometime in early February and at the very latest by Monday, 14th of February 2005. It is satisfied that this is the only inference reasonably available from the totality of the evidence. The trial chamber is therefore satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. عياش possessed the requisite knowledge that the explosive device was liable to create a public danger. That is also the only conclusion that is reasonably available from the evidence. The same evidence establishes beyond reasonable doubt his knowledge and his intention to murder Mr. Hariri with explosive materials. The trial chamber therefore finds Mr. عياش guilty beyond reasonable doubt as a co-perpetrator of the intentional homicide of Mr. Rafik Hariri. The same evidence also establishes beyond reasonable doubt his knowledge and his intention to commit the intentional homicide of 21 other people and the attempted intentional homicide of the 226 others. Mr. عياش intended to kill the members of Mr. Hariri's convoy and the members of the public who died in or as a result of the explosion or who were injured in the attack. Or legally, alternatively, he at least foresaw that deaths would occur and accepted that risk. The trial chamber also finds, in respect of the 226 people injured in the attack, that their death was prevented solely by circumstances beyond the perpetrator's control. There is no other conclusion reasonably available from the evidence. Detonating a truckload of explosives in a busy street near occupied buildings will inevitably kill many people. Some may die, some may not die, but instead sustain injury. Some injuries will be severe. However, whether or not these people die from their injuries, the act of participating in the detonation of the explosion was an act likely to cause death. In this respect, the conduct amounted to an attempted intentional homicide with premeditation by using explosive materials. Although Mr. عياش did not act alone, he had an important role in the operation against Mr. Hariri. The trial chamber is therefore satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the prosecution has proved the guilt of Saleem Jamil عياش on all counts charged in the amended consolidated indictment. Turning to Hussein Hassan Onesi and Assad Hassan Sabra. Mr. Sabra's attributed mobile, Purple 018, and Mr. Onesi, using his personal mobile, Purple 095, called each other and Mr. Merai on Purple 231 during the relevant pleaded period. Their mobiles were near areas where some false claim-related activities took place, such as the Arab University Mosque in late December 2004 and early January 2005. The two personal mobiles were used near relevant payphones on 14th of February 2005, and the tree from which the video was collected. Their personal mobiles stopped use shortly before the attack. This conduct, however, is insufficient either to prove conduct that assisted the perpetrator's preparation for the attack or that helped to shield the perpetrators or accomplices from justice. Their actions in Mr. Onesi being in these locations and Mr. Sabra's shared personal mobile, Purple 018, also being there, therefore do not satisfy legally the actus reus. That's the actions necessary to prove accomplice liability. The prosecution has also failed to establish the mental element of accomplice liability for either accused. Using or not using a mobile, calling each other and being somewhere in the area of locations where false claim-related activities took place cannot demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that they knew and accepted that the perpetrators would carry out an attack using an explosive device that was likely to kill people and to spread terror. This is said, it is emphasised, on the assumption that Mr. Sabra was using his attributed mobile at all relevant times. Even if it was proved that they did participate in calling the news agencies after the attack on 14th of February 2005, the trial chamber cannot conclude beyond reasonable doubt that the two were aware in advance of the attack, which occurred at around 12:55, that calling Al Jazeera and Reuters later that afternoon was connected with the attack. This is an essential legal requirement as an accessory under the Lebanese Criminal Code. The trial chamber accepts that if they indeed participated in making the calls to either news outlet, by virtue of the content of the letter that was read during the call, they would have known then, at that point, that their actions were connected with the attack. However, this would not of itself prove their knowledge of this before the attack, as is required for criminal liability as an accomplice under the Lebanese Criminal Code. The trial chamber's conclusion as to the lack of evidence that Mr. Onesi or Mr. Sabra participated in the, quote, Muhammad deceit, unquote, the, quote, abduction, unquote, of Mr. Abu Adas, or the dissemination of the false claim, therefore precludes their liability as accomplices. The trial chamber therefore finds that Mr. Onesi's and Mr. Sabra's liability as accomplices for the crimes charged has not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial chamber's determination that the prosecution failed to prove the two accused took part in the false claim is fatal to the charge of conspiracy against them. The trial chamber therefore finds that Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra cannot be found responsible for conspiracy to commit a terrorist act as charged in count 1 on the indictment. Turning to Mr. Hassan Habib Mehi. Mr. Mehi's sole pleaded role in the conspiracy is as the coordinator of the false claim of responsibility. This depends upon Mr. Onesi and Mr. Sabra acting as charged. Concerning the conspiracy and the alleged calls to and from Mr. Badruddin in the Green Network, and in particular Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance, the only reliable evidence supporting it is of mobile calls between the 3 purple mobiles over 2 separate periods. And both aspects come solely from the call data records of 2 mobiles in 2004 and 2005, namely his personal mobile Purple 231 and the Green Network mobile 071. There is no reliable evidence of anything relevant to the case regarding the making of the claim of responsibility, including its preparatory activities involving Mr. Abu Adas occurring on these days. Without these connections, the calls between Mr. Badruddin's Green 023 and Green 071 lack context. It is emphasised, no evidence of what was said in the calls or any meetings between the users of the Green network mobiles. There is no context from which the trial chamber can determine why the calls were made. It has insufficient evidence to connect these calls to Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance. When the evidence regarding Muhammad, in inverted commas, goes, all that remains are the calls between Mr. Merhai and Mr. Anesi and Mr. Sabra's shared mobiles in the weeks before Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance. Of itself, no matter how holistically the evidence is viewed, this cannot provide sufficient proof of their involvement in Mr. Abu Adas's disappearance, and certainly not for the pleaded purpose, namely of finding someone suitable to make a false claim of responsibility. Mr. Merhai's sole role in the conspiracy is connected with the false claim of responsibility and coordinating Mr. Anesi and Mr. Sabra. As the trial chamber is not satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the pair did any of the pleaded activities, namely those connected with Mr. Abu Adas's alleged grooming, luring, disappearance, alleged, quote, abduction, unquote, and subsequent appearance on the broadcast video, it likewise follows that Mr. Merhai cannot be found guilty of coordinating these activities. Mr. Merhai allegedly coordinated with Mr. Badruddin the preparation of the false claim of responsibility. He allegedly coordinated the activities of Mr. Anesi and Mr. Sabra in the lead-up and aftermath of the attack. But the trial chamber cannot find beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Merhai was using Green 071. And even if he were, there was no reliable evidence providing context to the calls with Mr. Badruddin's mobile Green 023. The trial chamber cannot link Mr. Anesi and Mr. Sabra to the false claim of responsibility. Accordingly, the link between Mr. Merhai and the false claim of responsibility is missing. He must be acquitted. Turning to whether Mr. Mustafa Amin Badruddin had a role in the conspiracy. To connect Mr. Badruddin to the conspiracy to commit the terrorist act and to murder Mr. Hariri, the trial chamber must be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the only reasonable conclusion available from the evidence is that Mr. Badruddin had the intention and performed the necessary acts to commit the crimes charged. This is not a finding of Mr. Badruddin's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, as he is no longer an accused person. The trial chamber cannot find that the Green Network operated as a command mission network with Mr. Badruddin at its peak. In other words, that he was the main conspirator. The trial chamber has carefully examined each call in the Green Network, but to be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that that was indeed what was occurring and that no other reasonable conclusion is available from the evidence, each call has to connect to evidence of what was occurring when the calls were made. Despite the 80 brief calls made over 4 months, the trial chamber cannot reconcile their timing and the location of the callers with the prosecutor's pleaded allegation that Mr. Badruddin was at the peak of a conspiracy to commit a terrorist act in murdering Mr. Hariri. The calls have no content, and finding context from their timing and location is very difficult. There is also no evidence of what was said in the calls, nor of any meetings between Mr. Badruddin and Mr. عياش. One call on 14th of February 2005 appears connected to the attack on Mr. Hariri. The remaining calls, however, cannot be linked to anything directly connecting to Mr. Hariri, his movements, or any other evidence relating to the conspiracy pleaded. Therefore, it is not the only reasonable conclusion from the evidence that the Green Network acted as the mission command to coordinate Mr. Hariri's assassination. This does not alter the trial chamber's conclusions in relation to Mr. عياش. It is not necessary that the trial chamber find that Mr. Badruddin had the pleaded role alleged by the prosecutor to find that Mr. عياش participated in the conspiracy. The trial chamber, with Judge Brady dissenting on whether it should make legal findings on this issue at all, is not convinced that Mr. Badruddin had the role pleaded in the amended consolidated indictment. Judith? Turning to the disposition. The trial chamber, therefore, finds Saleem Jamil عياش guilty as a co-perpetrator of Count 1, conspiracy aimed at committing a terrorist act; Count 2, committing a terrorist act by means of an explosive device; Count 3, intentional homicide of Rafik Hariri with premeditation by using explosive materials; Count 4, intentional homicide of 21 persons in addition to the intentional homicide of Rafik Hariri with premeditation by using explosive materials; and Count 5, attempted intentional homicide of 226 persons in addition to the intentional homicide of Rafik Hariri with premeditation by using explosive materials. The trial chamber finds Hassan Habib Merhai, Hussein Hassan Onisi, and Assad Hassan Sabra not guilty of all counts charged in the amended consolidated indictment, namely counts 1, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Judge Nosworthy has appended a comprehensive separate opinion analysing several discrete aspects of the interpretation of the applicable law, including on the definition of terrorism and customary international law, and on accessorial liability. Judge Brady, as has just been mentioned, has written a short dissenting opinion confined to the legal issue of whether a chamber may analyse the criminal liability of an absent alleged co-accused once the name is removed from an indictment. I have written a declaration expressing concerns about potential violation of Hassan Habib Merhai's fair trial rights during the trial. I have also appended a separate opinion concerning several procedural aspects of the proceedings, including delays in the pretrial phase, and that neither the United Nations nor Lebanon has yet publicly recognised the injustice caused by the lengthy, unlawful detention of the four generals, unquote. The separate opinions, the declaration and the dissent are all on separate and distinct issues of concern to the individual judges, the three of us, and do not affect the result of the verdicts, which are unanimous. There are several other issues we have to deal with today. The first is, Madam Court Officer, I ask you to distribute the copies of the judgment which is in 5 volumes, 2,641 pages, to the parties and the participating victims. Can you please do that? Court officer is also handing to the parties and the legal representatives of victims a 149-page document entitled Summary of Judgment, which is the authoritative and abbreviated summary of the judgment, and it is footnoted, each paragraph is footnoted to the relevant paragraphs in the judgment itself. Concerning a transcript of the proceedings, there was no live transcript available today. The English transcript will be available, I'm informed, within 24 hours. The Arabic within 48 hours. The French, unfortunately, will take a little bit longer and will not be available until the 28th of August. The summary of the pronouncement of judgment, which the three of us have just read onto the record, will be available on the website very soon, the Tribunal's website. In relation to sentencing under Rule 171 of the Tribunal's, Special Tribunal's Rules of Procedure and Evidence, the proceedings are what we call bifurcated. That means there are distinct separate proceedings which follow a conviction. The trial chamber is minded to make the following orders to the parties. That is, the prosecution is to file its submissions on sentencing by Tuesday the 1st of September 2005, and the عياش defence is to respond with its written submissions by Tuesday the 15th of September 2005. 2020. Oh dear. Tuesday the 1st of September 2020 for the prosecution, and Tuesday the 15th of September for the عياش defence. Mr. Hannes, I take it that presents no difficulties for you, and Mr. Farrell? Mr. Farrell's indicating no. Mr. Hannes is also indicating no. We are not setting a word limit. The trial chamber is flexible with this. We would rather be properly informed than try and restrict you to artificial and arbitrary word limits. In relation to a hearing, if necessary, once we have reviewed the prosecution and عياش sentencing written briefs, the trial chamber will decide whether it needs to have a hearing. If it does, we will hold a brief hearing, probably in September, as soon as possible, as soon as we can after receiving the written submissions from the parties. We will also issue this afternoon an order which will annul the arrest warrants against the 3 accused who have been acquitted. That is Mr. Sabra, Mr. Onesi and Mr. Merhai. That completes the proceedings. We thank everyone who has participated for their work in this. I turn to the victims, and I just wish to say to you, we sincerely hope that the verdict today can give you some form of closure. In no way we understand can you ever be satisfied by anything we say, but we hope that we in some way can give you something out of this. So we thank you again very much for coming, and we wish you well on your return to wherever you go. The proceeding and the court is adjourned.
All rise, veuillez vous lever. تفضلوا بالوقوف.